Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, and I'm finally ready to do my full review on the Brian Brown Yeager-M. This is the production version of the Brian Brown knives Yeager. It is the technically second run or second generation of these production variants of this knife. The first run was done by Wheat. This knife was made by Reat, and in typical Reat fashion, they kind of knocked it out of the park. This knife is one that the second that I saw him announce that there was going to be this production run of these, I wanted one. I was an idiot and I missed out on the pre-order and the drops and all that. Luckily, Kevin, Lefty EDC, picked this one up. He paid too much for it and it didn't really work super well for him as a lefty. And he knew that I really wanted it, so I paid slightly less. He was nice and didn't make me suffer for his crimes of paying too much on the secondary. But I purchased this from Kevin, and I've had this knife now for a couple of weeks, probably a month actually. And I've taken my time to do this full review for a couple of reasons. One, I've wanted to just keep putting it in my pocket and experiencing it more, so I'd have more to say about it. Two, when I finish reviewing a knife, I have less reason to keep carrying it with the same frequency because I need to be carrying the other things that are new that I'm trying to get ready to review. And I haven't wanted that change to happen. I've wanted to keep having a reason to put this knife in my pocket because of how much I love it. And so I've been putting off doing this full review, but it's time. People deserve the conclusion. It's also been fun. A couple of weeks ago, I recorded a podcast with Brian Brown of Brian Brown Knives, Brian Brown himself, and we had a great talk. That was one of my favorite podcasts that I've done. It was a lot of fun. I hadn't ever really spoken to him before that podcast, and coming out of that, I feel like he's a friend at this point. We've chatted a few times since. I sent him some stickers. He sent me some stickers. I just ordered one of his really nice titanium bit drivers, so that's coming soon. You'll be seeing that when it gets here, but he's a really cool dude and a nice guy, and he's a talented maker, and he's up to cool stuff. He's got more production stuff on the way. He's cranking out his customs, and he's even partnered with Keennison Knives now, too. They're making one of his models at Keennison, which is really cool. So, a lot that guy's up to. But let's talk about this. So, the Yeager-M, as I said, is a Reat-built production version of the Brian Brown Yeager. I think M also stands for medium. I think he does like a small and a large as his custom, so this kind of sits in the middle if I'm not mistaken, but I could be. So this one is pretty perfect size for me. I really, really like where this sits dimensionally. It makes it a fantastic primary knife for me that doesn't feel too big, doesn't feel too small. It's great in that way. Blade steel on this guy is going to be M390. And then this particular version, there were a couple of versions when these came out. This particular one has the micarta inlays. So it's a titanium frame lock with, you can see on the show side, a big micarta inlay, some OD green micarta. And then we've got on this side a small inlay as well. And it's a hollow grind on the M390 with a swedge. Nice flat hole for deployment. A bunch of these that came out, there were kind of two blade versions, if you will. Maybe you could call it that. But there were a bunch that were flippers that would have a flipper tab right here. This one is hole only, and that's what I wanted. I'm glad I have the one that's just a hole, and we'll talk more about why in a minute. But this one, you'll notice, is also wearing a slightly different clip than you would typically see on it. These were an option, Timascus clips. There were also Timascus pivot collars that you could get, and I had a buddy who didn't want to keep his Timascus clip, and so he sold it to me, and I brought it in and deanodized it. I took the ano out of the Timascus, so now I'm actually pretty happy with how it sits. I was thinking, after I did it at first, that I would try to kind of polish it a little bit. I got some Flitz polish that I was going to use on it, but it feels really smooth, and I kind of like that it's a little bit of a matte finish. It almost looks like kind of jeweled, but just faintly. I've grown to really like it the way it is, so I haven't touched it. I've left it just the same way. There's also like the slightest bit of bronze that kind of stuck through in some of these darker parts here towards the tip, and I feel like that matches well with the micarta that's on here. I just like it. So yeah, this one is the inlay version, as you can see. It's the flipperless version, as you can see. Other than that, this is just the Yeager-M production knife, and it has this clip added. So let's kind of jump off by first. Let me explain. In my interview with Brian Brown, I asked him, because I knew I was coming up to this review. I had planned on doing it long before now, but I had asked him what he kind of designed this knife to be. What was the philosophy of use? Where did he see this knife fitting for a user? And I really liked his answer. You can go back and listen to him actually explain it if you want, but if I were to try and encapsulate what I heard him say, is basically that it's an all-arounder, proper EDC knife, in the sense that this is an everyday carry knife that can go with you, whether you're in an urban environment, whether you're going out into the woods, whether you work in an office, or if you're somebody who hard uses your knives working in a trade. It is a robust enough, but sleek enough, slick enough, like it's a solid EDC offering. It is meant to be an everyday carry knife. It's not meant to be a bushcrafting fixed blade where you're batoning through wood. It's also not meant to be like a featherweight disappear in your pocket. It's just meant to be everyday carry. Something that would be reasonable and pleasant for most people to put in their pocket and take with them anywhere. So I liked that answer. I also don't like it when people are like, this knife is a tactical gentleman's knife, or like, this is an EDC outdoorsman's knife. Like, let it be one thing. And I think if EDC is where he finds it kind of slotting, I like that. I dig that. And I think it makes sense. And I agree with it in the way that I've experienced this knife and how it's done for me. I agree with his sentiments. So let's start by just kind of going over, I say start, now that I'm 7 minutes into this video. Let's go ahead and go through my typical talking points of ergos, carry, cutting, and action. And with those things, we'll paint a pretty good picture, I think, of how I feel about this knife, and then I'm sure I'll have more to say. And I'll probably get off track at some point, if we're being honest. But let's start with ergos. I like to start there because knives, for me, kind of start with ergos a lot of the time, frankly. If ergos suck, then the knife sucks, in my opinion. It's one of the most important things, period. Ergonomically, this knife is excellent for me. You have up here this finger groove that, for me, perfectly fits 2 fingers in it. And then you've got kind of a flat, I guess it's got a little bit of a radius to it, but you've got a secondary curve or flat, whatever you want to call it, back here for your next 2 fingers to land. So for me, in a saber grip, super comfortable. Hammer grip, super comfortable. Draw cut, actually really comfortable. Reverse grip, very, very comfortable. Reverse grip, draw cut, just fine. That feels good as well. So in any orientation that I put this knife in, it's very comfortable. On top of that, because this one is not the flipper version, and it's the hole only, there's no flipper tab right here. So I have this awesome spot where I can choke up and put my finger kind of onto this flat where the sharpening choil is in. I've got plenty of room to choke up to there. And so now I've got this nice kind of pulled in grip, and I've got a lot of control of the blade being all the way up here. I find myself using this grip a lot, and I like that I don't have the flipper version because that's what makes this possible. That is a win in my book. So yeah, lots of grips. All of them are comfortable. The ergos on this knife are neutral enough while still feeling like they lock me in. There's no jimping anywhere at all on this knife. Zero. None. Love that. I don't like jimping. I don't want jimping. I'd rather have ergos that lock my hand in. And this knife has it. These ergos lock my hand into place. In any grip that I'm in, I feel secure on this knife. Like it's not going to slip away from me, right? The materials are smooth. This micarta is finished very smooth. It's not rough. And so having an all smooth surfaces kind of feel to it with no jimping, it feels refined. It feels good. I love it ergonomically. Total win here. So ergos are great. Next, let's talk action. Love it. This knife, I have some skiff bearings that I could throw in here. I'm not going to do it. I've come to the conclusion. I've put skiff bearings in my Vero Mini Impulse, or Impulse Mini, and it feels like maybe a hair better, but it's virtually indiscernible to me. On knives with good actions, it just doesn't seem like it's that necessary to put different bearings in. I already like the action on this, and there's no sense for me in changing it at this point. Being a hole only for deployment, I middle finger flick it every time that I open it. And that's what I would do if there was a flipper tab too. I like to middle finger flick knives. It's my favorite way to open them. This hole is nice. It's chamfered on the inside, so it's not tearing up your fingernail when you do middle finger flick it. You can use it to thumb flick the knife. Works just fine in that way. But for me, why would I thumb flick it when I can do that? That is spectacular to me. So deployment, the detent is perfect for middle finger flicking. It's nice and crisp. It's just excellent in that way. On closure, this knife is not super drop shutty, which is funny. I love drop shutty, but I find myself not even wishing that this knife was. Just the way that it feels to me feels right and pleasant and predictable. And it's just, I don't know, I dig it. I like it a lot. I can, of course, kind of, if I give it some wrist on the way down, sure, I could slam it all the way shut, but it's not free dropping just by gravity alone. That said, it's not gritty at all. It's very smooth. It has just a pleasant kind of controlled sensation, and I like it. Yeah, so on opening and on closing, it feels great. The detent is just right. There's no such thing as a failure to deploy for me on this one. Middle finger flicking it is just perfect, 10 times out of 10. On top of that, I was talking to Brian a little bit about this on the podcast. The sounds that this knife makes are truly excellent. I think he was even saying on the ones without the inlay, it sounds even better somehow. I don't know. I've only experienced this one. But because this blade is hollow ground the way that it is, let me shut up and do a little ASMR. I don't know if that'll come through, but there's this like metallic like ting when it opens, because the thinness of the grind and the way that it's coming up to this tip, apparently the way Brian described it, that's what's giving it that sound, and I love it. It's just so satisfying the way there's that like tiny high-pitched little ting as it opens, but it's not like, I don't know, it doesn't make the knife seem like small or weak in any way, that it's getting that like zing when it opens. It just makes it seem like, I don't know, it makes me like the grind even more, that I can hear how thin it is, because I love knives that are thin behind the edge, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But yeah, the sensation, the feeling of it, the sound of it, action is all very, very good. And the more that time goes on, the more I appreciate knives that sound good. It might seem weird and insignificant, but like it's a differentiating factor between, if there's a bunch of knives that all deploy really well, if one of them sounds cooler, then it'll be more fun to play with. That's just what I've found. So, action, phenomenal. Let's talk carry next. So, carrying this knife, I think this particular version has the advantage of not having a flipper tab. I like that. It keeps the whole thing a little bit more kind of trim in pocket. But in addition to that, this titanium frame lock has been internally milled pretty extensively. And it's not a lightweight knife. It's not heavy either. This just feels appropriate for the size and kind of sensation of this knife. The weight feels right. And in pocket, it feels very, very pleasant. The weight and the proportions, the thickness. I love this backspacer, by the way. The way it's rounded just feels extra smooth and pleasant. Yeah, the whole thing just feels nice in pocket. It's just pretty simple and rectangular. None of the edges are harsh or jagged. Everything is smooth and it feels nice. The pocket clip, not going to be deep carry. This one fits exactly the same as the typical factory clip, even though it's Timascus, but you get about that much of the knife sticking out of your pocket. Imagine that, right? Would I love it if this was a deep carry clip, came all the way to the butt of the knife? Of course, that's my favorite thing on pocket clips. That's my preference, but this feels really good for being a milled tie, or in this case, Timascus clip. In and out of the pocket, it's pleasant. You got plenty of retention. It's not moving around on you, and it's not an obscene amount of knife sticking out of pocket. Plus, if I'm gonna have knife sticking out of pocket, I want it to be a really nice. I want it to be a really nice knife. That's kind of a flex. Like, I want people to be curious what that is because it looks cool and nice up here. So I guess there's that. But yeah, it carries well. I've got no complaints on carry. So that leaves us with cutting performance. And there's a lot of ways this knife shines. Cutting is another one of them. This blade is just phenomenal. This hollow grind, for me, and my preferences on the way I want my knives to perform and the cutting tasks that I do as an EDC knife, it is so good. I love cutting with this knife. The thinness behind the edge is really, really good. They were able to get it very thin, and it's not such an abrupt hollow that it gets thick real quick either. It's kind of gradual, and it comes up nice and tall. I don't really like short hollow grinds, but I do love tall hollow grinds, and this is nice and tall. It's just, it also looks phenomenal. Look at that. It's beautiful the way they've done this vertical belt satin. But yeah, so we've got this swedge up here. We've got a perfectly flat edge, and it comes to a tip that's actually very sharp, very usable. On a Wharncliffe, oftentimes, or sheep's foot, I think a lot of people are worried about not having a tip at all. This is plenty of tip. When you really think about the angle necessary to pierce into something with this, there's plenty of tip there. And I find, I've explained this a lot lately, on Warnies, for a lot of the stuff that I'm doing every day, like cutting tape on boxes, it's nice that I can orient my hand like this and be cutting, instead of on a drop point or a tanto, having to orient all the way up like this to get the tip into something. This is just so easy to drop the tip down into material and kind of cut with that sweet spot right there for stuff like that. And then with it being such a perfect flat edge and being so thin behind the edge, it's just so predictable to use. Cutting cardboard, cutting apples I've cut with this, cutting internal packaging, clamshell stuff, like everything I've cut with this, it's just done great. This M390 has held its edge perfectly. I haven't even done a strop on this or anything. It's just going strong, and it's excellent. So I love it. It's also nice how well, I mean, I've used this knife quite a bit, and I can't see any wear marks on the blade. It's really done well with this belt satin. I think a lot of people would be kind of afraid of this finish because be worried about scratching it or something, but it's done really well for me. I think most of the cutting I also do is kind of down this way if it's like through cardboard and stuff, and it's kind of going with the marks of the belt satin, so maybe that helps too. But yeah, this knife cuts really, really well. So cuts super well, carries well. The action is phenomenal. The ergos are phenomenal. It's just like, in every metric that I kind of judge a knife by, it's fantastic. And then on top of that, this is genuinely one of my favorite looking knives that I've ever had. It's so gorgeous, in my opinion. I get that that's a very subjective category, if you will, and other people might think this thing is hideous. Cool. More for me. I love the way that this knife looks. It's got this cool, like, especially this inlay version. I feel like the lines of this knife are so like robotic, but micarta feels kind of like natural to me, if you will. And so it's this cool blend of materials and lines, and it's not overly complicated or complex looking, but it's gorgeous, and it's got plenty going on. It catches attention, and I don't know, I love it in person, I love it in photos, I love watching it on video. Like, it is a stunning looking knife, in my opinion, and I love it. So yeah, this is one of my favorite knives in my collection. I'll be doing an update on my top 10 soon, and it's been a little while since I last did that. Last time I did it was before I had this, or a couple of things that will now make it in, so the list will be changing. But in my knife case, I have kind of a top 4 row, because my 20 knife case is 5 rows of 4, and my Koenig Arius has been number 1 slot in my collection for a long time, since I've had it. And the other ones, it kind of changes based on what I have. And so right now, the way I keep that case, it's actually right here. It's Koenig Arius, Demko 8020, and then it's my CKF Evo 2.0, and then it's this. And sometimes I'm tempted to even put this in front of the Evo. I don't know which one is actually my favorite between the two. It's a phenomenal knife. It's one of my favorites. I know that right now, they're not easy to get. On the podcast, Brian talked about how Knife Joy is going to be getting an exclusive version that they'll be dropping at some point. I don't know when that will be. Who knows what that will look like. It hasn't been announced yet, but hopefully that'll be relatively soon. I believe Brian does plan on doing additional runs of these in the future. He also has his new Raptor model coming soon, which we talked about on the podcast. And yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening with him. If you're able to get one of these for a price on the secondary that doesn't hurt too bad, then do it. I love this knife. I paid more than this knife is worth new, and that's usually a thing that I don't do very readily or often. And if I do, then I usually end up selling the knife rather than keeping it. This is a keeper for me. This is one of my favorite knives, and I adore it. It is so good. So yeah, this is the Brian Brown Yeager-M production knife, and it's one of my favorites. I absolutely adore it. It's so good. So I guess that's my full review. It's excellent. I don't know much else that I could say about it other than it's one of my favorites in a sea of knives that I not only own but have reviewed in recent time. It is absolutely like top 5 material at the very least of all the knives that I've ever owned. So there. Thanks, guys. And I'll link to Brian Brown down below. Really great dude. And like I said, he's got cool stuff coming. So if you're not following along with him, now's a good time so that you don't miss out on the next thing that he comes out with, because it's a safe bet that it will be worth having, knowing him. Anyway, thanks, guys. I'll see you on the next one.